Welcome to an episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and co-producer here on HORUFADHI Media alongside Suleiman Hashi. On this week's program, as reports emerge that the Joint Ministerial Committee on Contractual Procedures signed off a new framework which has been rejected by Puntland. Is Somalia ready to tap into its natural resources as the country remains divided on how such resources ought to be distributed and licenses granted while the legal framework remains at its infancy? This is the topic on the program today. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar contents, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media. Also, do subscribe to HORUFADHI Media Group's second channel known as HORUFADHI TV, where you're currently watching this program, and where you can find other exclusive programs such as the African Weekly Roundup and Maha Sela, among others. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Suleiman Hashi, Yasin Abdi, and the Baidoa Agreement Media team on our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment. Let's get straight into the news. Over the last decade, there has been an exponential boom in the exploration of hydrocarbon resources in East Africa region, which is being categorized as the new frontier of oil and gas exploration in the globe, especially as the globe looks for alternative sources of energy away from Russia and the Middle East. Amongst the naturally blessed countries is Tanzania, where huge reserves of gas was found off the coast. There have also been discoveries in Ethiopia and Kenya. In fact, some of these discoveries have resulted in border disputes between states. For example, Somalia and Kenya disputed over oil blocks in the southern Jubaland region of Somalia, which was eventually settled by the International Court of Justice last year. The world has kept a close eye on Somalia, however, which is reported to hold large quantities of oil reserve. Geoseismic studies have shown that Somalia may have at least 30 billion barrels of oil and gas reserves. For a country in which almost 70% of the population live below the poverty line, the oil and gas industry could dramatically change the fortune for millions of Somalis, and a country that has been ravaged by civil war and poverty for 3 decades. So, with the Somali Petroleum Law being passed by Parliament and signed by former President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo in 2019, why is there continued delay regarding the implementation? Let's take a look at the history of petroleum exploration in Somalia. So prior to 1991, international oil and gas companies had exploration agreements in Somalia. However, before any major exploration could be completed, Somalia would disintegrate into a major civil war that resulted in many of them withdrawing from the country due to security concerns. By 2008, the transitional government of Somalia attempted to revive its hydrocarbon sector, and this would be continued by the newly created federal government in 2012, led by President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, which signed a landmark agreement with federal member states to share any petroleum revenue between the federal government and the federal member states. This would create some of the foundational necessary frameworks to re-attract foreign investors. For instance, by 2019, Shell and Exxon made $1.7 million in legacy payments for 1990-2008 owed under a previous concession agreement. President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud also awarded seismic survey agreements and a production sharing agreement to Spectral Geo, now acquired by TGS and Soma Oil and Gas respectively. Now, the most important part of the modern day Somali petroleum exploration industry is the Baidoa Agreement of 2018. Now, federal government and state government leaders would meet in the transitional capital of southwest state Somalia, Baidoa, in the summer of 2018 to discuss national security as well as the ownership, management, and revenue sharing of the country's natural resources. In a 3-article agreement, federal leaders agreed upon the ownership of Somalia's natural resources, which is outlined under Article 1 of the agreement, which stipulates that the ownership is reserved to the Somali people. And Article 2 and 3 discuss the management of the resources and the distribution of the revenue respectively. Let's take a look at some of the more important elements to this agreement. Now, Article 2, subsection C. The responsibility of creation of federal laws and signing agreements is held by the Ministry of Petroleum in liaison with state ministries of petroleum. Article 2, subsection E, the creation of an inclusive Somali Petroleum Agency under federal law. It will lead negotiations and preparations for licenses, as well as inspection, verification, and implementation of petroleum laws. Now, the SPA will comprise of one member representing each representing each regional government, and 2 members representing the federal government. And Article 2F, the creation of the Somali Petroleum Corporation, which is yet to be created. And the reason why I'm mentioning these particular articles is because they're relevant to what's going on today with what we're seeing regarding Puntland. Now, the Puntland state government is the first regional government to reject tendering procurement proposals put forth by the newly appointed Joint Ministerial Committee under Contractual Agreement set up by President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud. In fact, Baidoa has gone so far as to reject the Somali Petroleum Act 2020, which was passed by the federal parliament as unconstitutional, and the state government elucidates that the law does not follow the Baidoa Agreement of 2018. Conversely, the Hassan Sheikh Mohamud administration is going ahead with the Somali Petroleum Act of 2020 as a legal basis to commercialize Somalia's natural resources, a decision that is currently increasing the ever-growing rift between Puntland's leader Saeed Dani and President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud. President Saeed Dani of Puntland refused to attend the National Consultative Council Summit in Mogadishu last week, which he attended via Zoom, which really demonstrates the level of hostility between the two leaders. Now, to make matters worse, Puntland also does not observe the Somali Petroleum Agency as illegitimate at the current time. In a statement released in the summer of 2021, the Puntland state government argued Article 2E of the Baidoa Agreement was not followed because Baidoa did not have, and I quote, no official representative at the Somali Petroleum Agency. So, what is the current situation regarding Somalia's natural resources? Somalia has consistently been ranked amongst the most corrupt governments in the world in recent decades. It was previously not uncommon for federal ministers to sign secret agreements with international and foreign organizations without parliamentary approval. The most recent example of this was during the latter period of President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo's caretaker government, in which Federal Minister for Petroleum and Mineral Resources Abdurrashid Mohammed Ahmed announced an agreement with an American upstream oil and gas exploration and production company called Coastline Exploration Limited without parliamentary approval. In separate statements, President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo and Prime Minister Mohamed Hussein Roble rejected the deal, declaring it both as null and void. Now, both leaders cited government decrees and directives banning all ministries at that time from signing agreements with foreign governments and organizations until the ongoing parliamentary elections were to be finalized. Now, there have been current reports that upon taking office, President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud signed off this very agreement. However, there has not been solid confirmation as of yet. So, what is the Joint Ministerial Committee on Contractual Procurements or Agreements? Now, interestingly, as an opposition candidate, President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud strongly condemned this committee set up by Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, which oversaw the distribution of contracts and how contracts would be signed between foreign companies, state governments and federal governments. But instead of this, however, rather than condemning as he did as a candidate, he controversially appointed new members once he was elected. The current committee is composed of key Hassan Sheikh Mohamud allies, including Interior Minister Ahmed Fiqi, Finance Minister Dr. Elmi Noor, and Justice Minister Hassan Ma'alim, who are all members of the UPD. Some have criticized the president for these actions, which demonstrate deception to some degree. Last week, the committee signed off a new procedural framework for the federal government and foreign companies, which would involve how they would sign agreements, which has been vehemently rejected by the Puntland state government. In fact, reports have emerged today that a delegation led by the Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources, Abdulrazak Mohammed, flew to Abu Dhabi, the capital of the UAE, to discuss possible deals brokered by the Emirati government. What is important to note here is that the new procedure signed by the Joint Committee and approved by the Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources has not been approved by the federal parliament. Now, the biggest question on the table is Somalia actually ready to tap and sell its natural resources? The reality is that Somalia is currently ruled loosely by clan states, and is a land in which there is hardly any foundational legal infrastructure to underpin the sale of petroleum in a manner that protects Somali citizens and the Somali government and the Somalia as a state from corruption and upholds accountability. The exploration for petroleum is an activity that has a myriad of layers. It involves federal and state laws. It requires environmental and sovereignty considerations, as we've seen around with Kenya. It is something that requires meticulous planning and is undertaken over a number of decades. What is clear is that Somalia currently does have a nationally accepted framework for petroleum trade under the Baidoa Agreement of 2018. However, the Petroleum Act of 2020 has been more controversial and is currently not accepted by a key federal member state, Puntland. For the Somali government to move forward, it must avoid signing discrete deals as previously done under the previous Hassan Sheikh Mohamud administration, for instance with Soma Oil and Gas, which was found to be rife with corruption and illegal investigations in the United Kingdom. The reality is that future possible oil reserves in Somalia could exceed 100 billion barrels of oil, effectively giving a population of just over 10 million people control of the world's fifth largest oil reserves, more than in the UAE and Kuwait. The Somali government and the Somali people must be very wise with their decision making, must be very observant, and must do this trade in equity and in equality.